Welcome to the first episode of 80s Ladies and Beyond, the podcast about the first classes of women to enter the United States Air Force Academy. For USAFA, that day was June 28, 1976, and we're launching this podcast 50 years later. I'm Diane Juhas, a member of the class of 1980. I'm joined by my classmate, Dr. Allison Hickey, for the co-hosting duties. Allison, this is the first episode. Do you believe it? I'm really excited.
Yeah, I am too. I remember, Diane, when you reached out to me to say, what do you think about doing this? And I was still sort of living in the space of watching women's stories disappear. And I thought, what a great way to capture some really significant women's stories that are uniquely connected to this event of women being in the first class and beyond to attend the United States Air Force Academy. And so I'm thrilled to be here today as we really get off and get started, and look forward to all of the stories we will hear from as many of our classmates as we can twist arms to tell them. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So you'll hear more about us as the episodes continue. But for this kickoff episode, we're going to cover the time leading up to women entering the service academies. Our special guests today, who are historians in their own right, are two of our classmates, Dr. Karen Willhelm and Dr. Ginny Caine Tonneson. Let me tell you a bit about them. Karen was an aircraft maintenance officer, and she was a commander for 2 aircraft maintenance squadrons. As an 06, she was in command of the 2nd Maintenance Group in Barksdale Air Force Base. She served on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon, writing strategy documents, and was a speechwriter for the chairman. She was faculty at the United States Air Force Academy as a captain and at the National War College. She retired in 2007, earned her doctorate in liberal studies at Georgetown University. She was an adjunct professor at George Mason University and retired from that in 2020. Now she's volunteering, teaching sometimes through Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and is researching an article to mark the 80s Ladies' 50th anniversary. Welcome, Karen. Ginny was a super achiever while at USAFA. She was on the deans, commandants, and superintendents list various times. She was an all-American swimmer and was captain of the swim team. She earned the Outstanding Athletic Achievement Award at graduation. After graduation, she married one of our classmates and her squadron mate, Larry Tonneson. And then she was an intel officer, had lots of assignments in intel. In 1992, she was assigned to USAFA as an Air Officer Commanding, or AOC, where her squadron, of course, won the Superintendent's Trophy in 1993 for outstanding academic and leadership achievement. She earned the O'Malley Award as the Outstanding AOC. After retiring from the Air Force in 2000, she pursued her passion, which is education. Ginny holds 2 master's degrees, one in history and education and a PhD in educational policy, planning, and leadership from the College of William and Mary. She has been a mathematics teacher, a postdoctoral research associate, and an adjunct professor at William and Mary. She owns her own educational consulting company where she works on teacher and leader effectiveness projects and State Department of Education, educational organizations, individual school districts, and international schools in over 30 countries. She's co-authored 2 books, and she recently published a book titled Joining the Long Blue Line, The First Women at the Air Force Academy. And I'm going to bring my copy to our celebration later this month so that you can autograph it for me.
Me too. I have mine. Hey, Ginny, I think I also heard that you may have been the very first recipient as a woman in our class to the Air Force Academy. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was told I was the first appointee.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yeah, there were 3 swimmers that were recruited. I was one of the first 3, but they didn't announce it until they had 6 to manage the publicity. So,
well, congratulations on that. That's a unique part of your story.
Thank you, Allison.
All right. So welcome, Karen and Ginny, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this important episode. I know we have a limit of time to get started to share everything that we have in this episode. So Let's take a look at the impetus for women entering the academies. What happened? How did it all come about? Karen, go ahead and get us started, please.
Well, thanks, Diane. And I wanted to start by thanking you and Allison for actually putting this all together. I know it's been a lot of work, and it's going to be a great resource for people. And I really appreciate being invited to be part of this first episode. I want to start back at the beginning by saying it's important to remember that women have served in American wars since the Revolution. In the earliest years, they were called camp followers, and they traveled with their husbands, their fathers, sometimes their sons, to take care of chores like laundry and sewing and cooking. Some of them served more directly as spies and couriers, and some even disguised themselves as men or boys to serve in the ranks of the soldiers and fight. Of course, many served as nurses, and this general pattern continued through the Civil War. With the Civil War, and then the Spanish-American War of 1898, it was clear that some sort of permanent military nursing organizations were needed. And so finally, Congress passed legislation in 1901 establishing the Army Nurse Corps, and in 1908, the Navy Nurse Corps. Now, these nurses had only a quasi-military status. They didn't carry any military rank, and of course, they did not receive equal pay or any other kind of benefits. With the tremendous casualties of World War I, you get a huge expansion of the U.S. military in general, of the nurse corps, but also now recruitment of women for enlisted positions. The Navy led the way, and they assigned women as enlisted yeomen. And a yeoman is basically an admin troop. And then they opened some other enlisted technical positions to women. The Marines accepted women for similar work, but not until August of 1918, which was just a few months before the war ended. Now, the Army, despite entreaties from the commanders in Europe, including the Commander-in-Chief, General John J. Pershing, refused to use women as anything other than nurses, despite the need for woman power, if you will. In general, then, for the women in uniform in the enlisted ranks in the Navy and the Marine Corps, they were in uniform, but they did not, again, receive the same pay and benefits as the men who served in the same positions. So we skip ahead to World War II, and of course, we have an even larger expansion of the military forces of the U.S. And we get an accompanying much larger number of women in the ranks of both enlisted and officers. The Army formed the Women's Army Corps, the WACs. The Army Air Force was a subset of the Army at the time, so they had a subset of the WACs called Air WACs. The Navy had women accepted for volunteer emergency service, the WAVES. The Marines had female members, but they just called them Women Marines. No fancy acronym necessary. Establishing these organizations finally gave full military status to the women who were serving. But the process for doing that took from about mid-1942 well into 1943. And as General Jean Holm mentions in her history of women in the military, it was just a convoluted bureaucratic mess trying to make this happen. So after the war, Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Act, which was signed by President Truman in June of 1948. And the key point of this legislation was establishing permanent roles and positions for women in the regular organizations of all four services. The Army retained the WACs, the Navy the WAVES, and the Women Marines continued being Women Marines. But the Air Force had become a separate service with the National Defense Act of 1947. So the Air WACs were transferred to the new United States Air Force, and new female recruits were called women in the Air Force. Air Force leaders just hated the Army's system of corps. They didn't want to duplicate that. So they didn't want something like the Signal Corps or the Women's Army Corps. So the Air Force women were not the Women's Air Force. But the problem was the acronym was still UAF, WAF, for women in the Air Force. And that led to a huge amount of confusion and most of the time the assumption that the WAF was somehow separate from the regular Air Force. Also, during this Air Force transition, there was a lot of disagreements about how to administratively manage Air Force women. as if somehow they were some sort of separate species that couldn't be managed the same way men were managed. In 1949, the Air Force created an official policy making a dual chain of command for enlisted women. The women were assigned to their regular duty units for work and performance evaluations, so they were officially integrated into the Air Force. But they were all also administratively attached to WAF squadrons for, as the policy put it, guidance, counseling, and off-duty supervision. If I wanted to briefly summarize the post-World War II period, that 1948 Women's Armed Services Act gave women a regular place in the armed forces. But it didn't lead to any significant increase in numbers except for a brief time during the Korean War. And overall, changes to women's roles and numbers proceeded at a rather glacial pace. Now, I want to interject one other little relevant fact here, and that is while the status of women in the military was being refined, Air Force leaders began pushing to create their own academy to educate and commission Air Force officers instead of relying on the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and the Naval Academy. The law establishing the Air Force Academy was passed on the 1st of April, 1954.
And Karen, I have some little factoid I'd like to just throw in here. Lieutenant General Hubert Harmon, we know him from Harmon Hall. He would become the Academy's first superintendent, and he wrote, quote, "The Air Force Academy Act prescribes that our institution shall be the training of selected young men. If you can get the law changed, I shall be delighted to take in young ladies as well." So that's a pretty progressive stance for 1954. And I know you and I both actually looked up the actual law, Public Law 83-325. And it never actually says selected young men, as he quoted. It just says selected persons, but then it uses he and his throughout the language. So we know it was talking about men. But I just thought that was interesting that in the 1950s, he was actually thinking that women could succeed at the Air Force Academy.
So that leads us to believe that the notion of admitting women to the Air Force Academy from its inception is intriguing, but for better or worse, was never really seriously considered despite the lack of a legal prohibition. So there wasn't anything legally stopping that from happening. But this suggests, and I think it might affirm, but I'm going to wait to hear from you, Karen, that it's always been about culture over law that needed changing. And I know we were part of that cultural change. However, by the early 70s, it seems like the pendulum is starting to swing because the idea of admitting women to all service academies became a more serious proposition. So, Karen, can you tell us about the ideas and events you believe were the underpinning to push for that change?
Sure. Those of us of a certain age can remember that the period of the mid-60s to the 70s was one of significant social and cultural change. And that, in turn, created significant pressure for change within the U.S. military services, including, as you said, starting to consider the admission of women to the service academies. This was the time period of the women's movement. Women were attending college in increasing numbers. All-male institutions, for example, Yale and Princeton, had started admitting women. Women were serving in government in increasing numbers, especially at the state and local levels. Most importantly, women were beginning to be willing to stand up and to make demands, to question exclusions and the reasoning behind them. The women's movement demanded equal treatment and equal rights in all kinds of circumstances. Now, a second factor creating momentum for change in the military was the end of the draft and the transition to the all-volunteer force, beginning in 1973, just as the Vietnam War was ending. The anti-war movement and the U.S. failure in Vietnam meant that there weren't enough young men interested in voluntarily enlisting. So the recruiting of women to serve was going to have to be increased significantly. I enlisted in the Air Force in 1974. If you could walk and breathe at the same time and weren't high on some controlled substance, you were basically qualified, whether you were a woman or a man. The Air Force had opened up almost all of its officer and enlisted career fields to women. I wanted to work on airplanes in an electronics job. And of course, I had to take the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And my recruiter called me one day and he said he had gotten my scores. And kind of a bit of trepidation, I said, okay, well, am I qualified for the job we've been talking about? And he said very dryly, "You're qualified for any job we have." I'm like, okay, great. I went off to basic training in October of 74, and I was a WAF. There were 2 squadrons of women trainees. There were WAF squadrons. The training squadrons and the dormitories were segregated. Went to tech school at Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois. The dormitories were segregated. And I was assigned a female WAF commander in addition to being assigned to a standard school squadron. But the classes were completely integrated. Upon arrival at my first and only enlisted duty station at Andersen Air Force Base, Guam, first time I'd ever seen the ocean, I was assigned to the 43rd Avionics Maintenance Squadron for work. But the Air Force is still following that policy that it had established in 1949. So I also answered to some poor lieutenant who was the WAF squadron commander. And I lived in the WAF dormitory. All the women who didn't have a reason to live off base were living in the WAF dorm, regardless of their duty units. But changes in the numbers of women and the opening of so many career fields made the WAF organizational construct less and less relevant and definitely less and less useful. But within a few months of my arrival at Andersen, the WAF squadron was disestablished, and we moved to our unit dormitories. By 1976, the concept of separately labeling and managing female Air Force members had simply melted away. The personnel functions were gradually taken over by the standard Air Force personnel functions. In June of that year, the WAF director, Colonel Bianca Tremoloni, retired, and the position was eliminated.
Karen, what were some of the factors putting pressure on the military to admit women to the service academies?
Well, first, looking back, we can see that the changes in the social perspectives and the rise of women's activism that I just mentioned led to a string of legal challenges and changes to women's rights with respect to employment and education, including the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And then 1972 was a momentous year with the passage of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, Title IX of the Education Amendments, and the Equal Rights Amendment was passed by Congress. Title IX and the ERA were important tools for those advocating to admit women to the academies, even though neither specifically addressed this issue. In fact, Title IX, which prohibited sex discrimination in admissions to educational institutions, explicitly exempted schools whose primary purpose was training individuals for military service. But this exemption became logically weakened when the services opened their ROTC programs to women. The services assumed that the ERA was going to be ratified by the states and fairly quickly. Therefore, they knew they were going to have to adapt and change women's roles. And that added weight to the arguments to admit women to the academies.
Who were the leading advocates for admitting women? And Allison, when did you hear about the impending change being passed?
So thanks, Diane. And I'm going to start with one that had some specific influence on the conversation about women and the military service academies, and that is Congresswoman Pat Schroeder. I happened to be working with Congresswoman Schroeder on a completely separate matter related to military families and securing some benefits, increased benefits around them. And she told me during that time about efforts that some key individuals were doing to put pressure on then President Ford. If you don't know, Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder was not just an advocate for women in general, but really for women in the military and then specifically to the academies, because although she assumed office in 1973, she became the first woman on the House Armed Services Committee. So she lived and worked in that space surrounding the military and people who served. As an example, 1975-76 debates on women attending the military service academies, Congresswoman Schroeder is quoted in the congressional record as saying, quote, "If women are capable of serving in the military, and they are, then they must also have the opportunity to compete for education and leadership training provided by the service academies." I'm a big person that likes sources. in order to validate what was said. That, for anyone who wants to look it up, is in the 1975 congressional record on the House debate on the defense authorization legislation. She also stated, and I quote it, "If we believe in equal opportunity in this country, we cannot say to women, you may serve your country, but you may not train for leadership." Again, that's in that same congressional record as its source. So returning to our specific conversation that she and I had, she cited to me meetings between a top group of women military officers, herself, and a couple of other congressional members, namely Samuel Stratton and William Roth Jr., who met with First Lady Betty Ford. And while there was no official documentation I could find on these meetings, it was a first-person account from her to me that when I was a young captain working in the Pentagon on an astrotour. But that story aligned with another meeting I had as a senior in high school when my dad, who was a serving Army general officer, brought one of the very few women general officers to our house to talk to me about my interest in going to a military academy, which my dad knew about. This meeting happened before President Ford opened the academies to women, and I remember her talking to me and sharing with me that there was a lot of activity going on in D.C., quote, that would likely open the academies to women soon. And she said, I remember her telling me to, quote, be ready. So I did exactly that and made sure I was ready. She talked about a group of women generals working the issue at the highest levels. So I will just highlight a little bit more about Schrader, Stratton, and Roth. Schrader introduced the House amendment removing sex discrimination in academy admissions. Schrader argued that women must have equal access to the leadership pipeline created by the academies, and Roth supported the change in both capacities in the Senate, emphasizing that women already served in uniform and deserved equal officer education. So back over to you, Karen, to take us on the rest of the story.
Thanks, Allison. That was a great summary. Within the Air Force, Major General Jean M. Holm was a tireless advocate for women, including the admission of women to the academy. She was the first woman promoted to one-star general in the Air Force and the first woman promoted to two-star general in any of the services. She was director of the WAF from November of 1965 through February of 1973, and her bosses extended her twice in that position. During her tenure then, policies affecting women were updated. The WAF strength was more than doubled. Job and assignment opportunities were greatly expanded, and she even got the uniforms modernized. She testified in favor of admitting women at a HASC hearing in 1972. And it's interesting to note that the director of Women Marines at the time, Colonel Jeanette Susted, also testified in favor. But the director of the WACs, Brigadier General Inez Bailey, was opposed, as was the director of Waves, Captain Robin Quigley. After her tenure as the WAF director, General Holm was appointed Secretary of the Air Force Personnel Council. And again, from that position, would have been able to advocate for women's admission to the academy. So all these committed advocates that Allison mentioned and General Holm and so on, they helped pass the legislation leading to the first women entering the United States Military Academy, the United States Naval Academy, and the United States Air Force Academy in 1976 as members of the classes of 1980. Now, to ensure the record is complete, I'm going to add that the Merchant Marine Academy had already admitted a small number of women in 1974. And the Coast Guard Academy also voluntarily admitted women in 1976, since the law did not encompass their student body.
I remember when I read General Holm's book, Women in the Military and Unfinished Revolution, that she said, and I quote, that opening the service academies to women was the single most important step towards integrating women fully into the leadership structure of the armed forces. I also remember reading a quote from our classmate, 4-star General Janet Wolfenbarger, where she said, and I quote, I came out of the academy realizing I was capable of far more than I ever imagined. And our other classmate, Linda Garcia Cubero, the first Hispanic woman, and by the way, she was the first Hispanic woman graduate of the U.S. Service Academy, where she said, and I quote, "The self-confidence I have today was built there." General Holmes understood the impact an academy experience would have on women's ability to make a difference in the military. And our classmates, Janet and Linda, confirmed it. I would pile on and confirm that my own experience was impacted as well, and it shaped my path to Brigadier General and also to serve as Undersecretary for Benefits at VA. By the way, Linda later turned around to help guide the institution as a member of the Board of Visitors from 2016 to 2020. That's a pretty significant and influential position to hold, and is a powerful symbol of how the pioneers of 1976 helped shape the Academy's future leadership. I'll also note we will hear from her sometime in the future, but she later had a sister that followed her into the Academy. So General Janet Wolfenbarger's career represents one of the most visible outcomes of the 1975 decision to open the service academies to women. As a member of the first class that included women in 1980, she rose to the highest rank in the United States Air Force, demonstrating the long-term leadership impact of that historic policy that would not have happened but for the advocacy and planning of so many. Speaking of planning, Ginny, you have told me that planning actually started much earlier than I even knew. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Way back in 1972, the Air Force Academy recognized that change was coming. And in May of 72, General Albert P. Clark, who was the superintendent at that time, he wrote to General Robert Dixon, who was the Air Force Chief of Staff of Personnel, and he said, "I believe women are soon going to be admitted to the Academy," and he urged proactive planning. Well, just a few weeks later, on June 6, 1972, Dixon formally directed that intense planning begin, and within a week, they had an ad hoc group that met in Washington to begin studying the issue. So I think what we all need to remember, at least for our service academy, was that our crowd was proactive. We weren't reacting, in 1975 when the law changed. We were thinking ahead and trying to get ahead of the game and consider those issues. Just as a side note, that same year, Senator Jacob Javits nominated a woman to the Naval Academy. And the purpose of that was really just to change the policy and draw attention to the exclusion of women from the academies. But also the initiative with women being able to go to the service academies was kind of gaining foothold with students. And just as a funny aside, I grew up either on base at the Air Force Academy or in Monument, which is just right north of it. And we had little postcards in our library that you could send in to get an information packet from the Air Force Academy. And my best friend's name was Toni, Toni. And so I dared her, "You send it in and let's see if they think you're a guy," because Toni could be either name. And then she dared me to send it in knowing that I would be rejected. So we both sent in our postcards. She got back a lovely information packet on here's how you apply. They thought she was a guy. And I got back a lovely letter that said, "Sorry, you can't come. You can go to a college with ROTC, or you can go to officer training school or to a nurse's program," which I thought was kind of interesting.
Thank you. That is a fascinating story. It's just like, wow, right? What happened? So, Karen, how did the advocates for admitting women make their case?
Well, those in favor of admitting women focused on issues of equity in terms of job opportunities and career advancement. For congressional advocates, this question of equity was boiled down to access to education, as highlighted by Title IX, because the education was a necessary first step toward a military career and promotion opportunities. So individual members of Congress started to directly challenge the exclusion of women. As Ginny mentioned, Senator Javits was one of the first. From 1972 to 74, there was a series of bills introduced and there were hearings held. In December of 1973, legislation was introduced in the Senate to permit women to attend the academies. It was killed in the House. The chair of the Armed Services Committee, F. Edward Hebert, was adamantly opposed to admitting women. During that time, Congressman Donald Fraser nominated a woman to the Air Force Academy. When her application was rejected without consideration, he pointed out the incongruity of DOD's stated goal to quadruple the number of women in the military by 1977, while denying them access to the best educational program of their profession. Another member of Congress, Courtney Stark, also nominated a woman to the Naval Academy. He said women should be admitted without question and immediately, and he proclaimed, "We need them." As Allison mentioned, Congresswoman Schroeder was a key advocate, and she said that passage of the ERA made it inevitable that women were going to attend the academy, so you guys might as well just get on with it. I'm kind of paraphrasing there. And she also said that women were going to attend for the same reasons that men attend: to start a military career, to become a pilot, to get a good education, and so on.
So what about the other side? How did the opponents argue against admitting women?
The opponents focused on the claim that the mission of the academies was to train combat officers. Now, the issue of women in combat, as well as the possibility of drafting women, had been raised in the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was very vigorous, if you will. In terms of prominent civilian opponents to women entering the academies, Jackie Cochran, the leader of the WASP, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots in World War II, holder of many aviation records, and qualified in multiple aircraft types, including many military aircraft, testified very vociferously against admitting women to the Air Force Academy. She said the basic reason is that the academies are for the purpose of teaching combat to their students, and labeled the idea of women in combat ridiculous, despite the fact that in November of 1944, a month before the WASP disbanded, she had proclaimed in a speech to have not the slightest doubt that the WASPs could have gone into combat fearlessly and effectively.
You know, that is one of the reasons I held strong objections to a display of Jackie Cochran memorabilia that was in Arnold Hall, just outside that theater we used to have to go to, because I knew she had opposed women attending the academy, and there she was, featured in full glory, right there in the very school that she did not believe you or I and all of our classmates and every woman since belonged. This created some real cognitive dissonance for me, and not just me, but for many other women. You still see this conversation in sites that feature USAFA Academy women, and about her lack of support and the implication that had to their feelings about her. But knowing as we do that the majority of the individuals that attend the academy and are in the Air Force never see a day of combat, this logic just didn't hold water and doesn't hold water today. There were other cultural issues going on, though, that were clearly in play. So what does your research suggest about these issues, Karen?
Well, one of the major points, again and again and again, that the opponents brought up was this issue of women in combat. And it was a major social issue. It was a change of mindset to even think about it. And the opponents used emotional appeals of talking about daughters being killed or raped and having to kill. And they drew vivid pictures of the physical and psychological unsuitability of women to withstand the rigors of battle. Now, the opponents offered some other rather more, prosaic reasons, I guess. They said, okay, if we admit women, that's going to require lowering standards. Now, they never mentioned academic standards in that regard. All they wanted to talk about was physical standards. And again, then to tie it back to the issue of serving in combat. Several of the military leaders testified, actually kind of emotionally, that, the culture and the Spartan character of the institutions would be undermined, if not totally ruined, by the admission of women. And then, of course, they all brought up the bugaboo of money. Oh my gosh. We would have to make too many modifications to facilities, the dormitories, the locker rooms, latrines, and so on. But the military took the lead in arguing against the legislation based on the requirement to produce combat leaders. Now, it's interesting to note that the initial positions within the services were somewhat mixed. But at hearings begun in late May of 74, the DoD presented a united position against the admission of women at the specific direction of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, William P. Clements, Jr. Clements directed service leaders, quote, to continue to refine the rationale and appropriate data to support the proposition that the service academies are institutions focused on producing leadership for combat.
So why was the law finally passed?
It was passed because the logic of basing exclusion on producing combat leaders was fundamentally flawed in two respects, and the opponents just didn't have any other compelling arguments. The first fundamental flaw was that the arguments against women in combat were based on myths and half-truths rather than facts, as explained by General Holm in her book, and that was the kind of an overarching flaw in this argument. She identified four myths. The first was that the exclusion of women from all combat jobs was stated in law, and it's simply not true. The law at the time said that women were excluded by law from Navy combat ships, but not Coast Guard ships, and from combat missions aboard Navy and Air Force aircraft, but not Army aircraft. There were no other applicable laws. All other exclusions were matters of policy. Now, myth number two was the assumption that it's possible to actually define combat to make clear distinctions between what is and is not combat duty and what is and is not a combat mission. Myth number three was that it's possible to protect military women from the risks and horrors of combat. As Holm emphasized, events, not policy or law, dictate who will be exposed to war and who will be in combat. And the final myth says that all forms of combat involve a great deal of physical strength and stamina, which is beyond the capability of most women. That's certainly true for some forms of combat, but just as certainly not true for others. Now, the second fundamental flaw in the argument of the opponents was their reliance on the assertion that academies were intended to produce combat leaders. The services knew that producing combat leaders was not the sole purpose or the mission of these academies. The Title X sections governing the United States Military Academy and the Air Force Academy begin with a statement that they are, quote, for the instruction and preparation for military service of selected persons called cadets. I couldn't find any statement regarding what the purpose of the Naval Academy is. As Allison mentioned, there's lots of statistics to support these assertions about who goes to combat and who doesn't. There's a GAO report issued in April of 75 that as of October of 1974, there were over 30,500 total Service Academy graduates on active duty, 12% of whom had never had a combat assignment. And recall that we're talking about the generation, the era of the Vietnam War, and still 12% had not made it into combat. The Air Force Academy was on especially thin ice with this argument. By policy, a given percentage of those accepted for a mission weren't pilot or navigator qualified. And that encompassed the 2 out of the 3 career fields that were not open to women officers at the time, the other being a missile launch officer. From 64 to 73, fewer than 40% of Air Force Academy graduates had combat jobs. And delve deeper into numbers of the 24 career fields open to the Air Force Academy, all but 3 were open to women officers, as I said, pilot, navigator, and missile launch officer. And being in so-called non-combat jobs does not preclude assignment to a combat zone. 1,170 Air Force women officers had served in Vietnam, and the whole country was designated a combat zone. If we wanted to drill down just a little bit farther into terms of what the Air Force Academy said about itself to its cadets, as far as I have found, the Air Force Academy mission statement, memorized by freshmen and basic cadets and regurgitated on demand from upperclassmen, That statement has never included reference to combat or combat leaders. To meet a 1963 grad a few months ago, and he still had his contrails, the little book of knowledge that has to be memorized by new cadets. In there, the mission of the Academy is stated as follows. The Academy provides instruction, experience, and motivation to each cadet so that he will graduate with the knowledge, character, and qualities of leadership essential to his progressive development as a career officer in the United States Air Force. This statement was consistent at least from 1960 through 1970. We can look back at our contrails, the 1976 edition, where we had to memorize the mission of the United States Air Force Academy is to provide instruction and experience to each cadet so that he graduates with the knowledge and character essential to leadership and the motivation to become a career officer in the United States Air Force. So what the Air Force Academy is telling its cadets is that its mission is to create career officers, not combat officers. So in short, the argument for excluding women based on the need to produce combat leaders was unsupportable, which allowed the proponents' argument based on equity to prevail. In fact, I want to add, I think the proponents made a strategic decision to decouple the question of admitting women to the academies from the question of allowing women to serve in combat jobs. And I think that was a smart strategy because it's unlikely they could have won a vote to eliminate the combat exclusion law at the same time. So they won on the admission of women, and it would be the early 90s before women were permitted to fly combat aircraft.
Okay, so the law is finally passed. Ginny, how did USAFA handle things? This is a big story. Go for it.
Yeah, well, Karen, thank you for that very thorough history. You told us some fascinating things that I wasn't aware of. But as I said earlier, in 1972, the Air Force Academy started getting proactive about figuring out how to integrate women. And by September of 1972, so 4 full years before we arrived, they had already drafted an integration plan. And so they spent the next 4 years modifying that, but they had something on the books 4 years before we arrived. And it had some major assumptions. The first was that men and women would go through the same experience. Only physiological differences would be a justification to make a modification. Other than that, everything was going to be the same. There would be no separate but equal track. The second assumption had to do with billeting. Women were going to live in existing dorms. They'd have to add privacy modifications, but integrating us, not isolating us, was the goal. Physical aptitude exam. Another assumption they had was they wanted the core evaluation to be maintained with the standards being adjusted for women and modifications only as needed. The fourth assumption was that we needed to have a critical mass of females. We didn't want to admit 1 or 2. We needed a pretty solid number. And so in 1972, they had come up with the idea that we needed to admit between 100 and 150 women in that first class. And sure enough, our class had 157. So that held true throughout all of their planning. And then the final assumption had to do with air training officers. As we all know, the class of 59 had 66 male air training officers, and that was a successful program. And so they decided that that would be something that they wanted to have when the first females arrived.
Ginny, what can you tell us about some of the unknowns?
There were lots of unknowns. So one of the big players at the Academy was Colonel Jim McCarthy, and he led a major task force that had to identify what don't we know so that we can figure out what we should do. And they took a very rigorous approach to this. They studied data, they dove into the literature, they visited coeducational institutions, and Karen mentioned this right at the beginning about Yale and so forth becoming coeducational. I don't think a lot of young women outside our age group realize that many colleges were not co-ed back in the 60s and early 70s. In fact, the Ivy Leagues, many of them had separate male and female colleges. They started integrating between 1969 to 74. In fact, Columbia wasn't fully co-ed until 1983. UVA wasn't co-ed till 1970, Duke 1972, VMI 1997. So it's a whole different era, I think, when young women just assume that all colleges are co-ed, because that's just not the way it was. So the service academies were not the only schools dealing with this issue, but that's why this task force went to visit these co-educational schools to find out, what did you do? What are some of the problems that you ran into? They also went to visit ROTC units. They went and visited Officer Training School. They went to Lackland Air Force Base. One of the things they were concerned about was, how would women file weapons? Would they flinch? Would they be afraid to pull the trigger? And what did they discover? That women handled rifles just the same as men handled rifles. And I think we've alluded to this all along, but their big takeaway was that many of the fears they had about women coming were just cultural assumptions. They weren't based in reality. And so, again, they tried to look at the data and really explore this in depth. Another thing that they discovered was that separate billeting would hinder integration. And keep that thought in mind when we start talking about the women being separate in Vandenberg Hall a little bit later. So anyway, this task force came up with an issues book that had 134 different issues in it. So everything that they could think of that could be a concern, they cataloged it, and then they determined policies for it before we ever showed up. One of the examples would be, what should we do when we counsel women? And after studying it, they decided, well, we should do the same thing for women that we do for men. So again, they didn't want to leave anything to chance. They wanted to answer all the procedural questions they could ahead of time. And I think we can be thankful that they took that rigorous of approach before we ever got there.
Wow, 134 issues. They were really documenting it all. I mean, that's great, actually. So how did the initial draft plan of 1972 evolve?
Jim McCarthy's task force continued on, and then they eventually, in July of 75, formed an official Commandant's Committee for the Admission of Women, and that was chaired again by Colonel McCarthy. And they widowed it down to 45, the top 45 priority issues. And among those were things like acceptance by the cadet wing and faculty. Not everybody obviously wanted us there. Billeting arrangements. What kind of modifications would we need for BCT? What would the role be for the ATOs? What would we do about fraternization? So each of those 45 issues was assigned to a working group. And again, they were studied intensely and they were coordinated academy-wide. And I think that is a very positive step that the academy took. They wanted to make sure that the athletic department and the faculty had the same ideas and policies in mind. They wanted everything to be totally integrated across the entire institution.
All right, you mentioned the ATOs. We're going to be conducting an episode with a couple of the ATOs coming up. But in the meantime, can you provide a few insights into the thoughts about why they were needed?
Sure. So, that was one of the assumptions back in 1972, is that we want the ATOs. What they were concerned about was the academy assumed that our class of women would not have female role models. If I think back to, at least on the academic side, I only remember ever having one female instructor. There just weren't a lot out there. They also were concerned that we would only be interacting with male leaders, not female leaders. So they wanted some female leadership around so that we could see how that played out. There were also concerns that the women might feel isolated. And I think this is kind of humorous. They were concerned that we might suppress our femininity and adopt exaggerated mannish behaviors to fit in. So the goal with having the ATOs, it wasn't to change the system, but they were demonstrating that women could complete the training, that they could thrive in the cadet wing, that they could lead effectively, and that they could remain feminine. And the ATOs reinforced that message. So they screened the records of hundreds of female lieutenants, and they selected 15 ATOs for our class. One of the differences was that with the 66 male ATOs, most of them had either gone to a service academy or a military-focused school, whereas none of our ATOs had that experience. They either went through ROTC at a civilian college, or they went through officer training school. But nonetheless, they arrived in January 16th of 1976, 6 months before we arrived, and they went through their training, and we'll learn about that a little bit more when we do the next podcast.
So talk about some of the modifications in the Competence Committee research.
Okay, so one of the things they looked at was academics. I think Karen kind of alluded to this a little bit early on, but academics, they figured minimum changes. Women would take the same curriculum. At that time, we had 21 majors. All of them were open to females. Classroom procedures were going to be the same. The only training they felt they needed to do for the faculty was on the cultural acceptance piece of that. And this is a really interesting note. Of all of Annapolis, West Point, and the Air Force Academy, the females in the class of 80 outperformed their male classmates academically. We had a higher average GPA in all three of the service academies. So academics, they didn't need to worry about that. We did just fine. Athletics, that was quite a challenge. You may have heard about Project Blue Eyes, and that was a groundbreaking women integration study, and they dove down and they looked into all sorts of data. They looked at things like women have a higher percentage of body fat, less upper body strength, a smaller heart size relative to body weight, less hemoglobin, better balance, lower heat tolerance, all the data. They researched that. And so they had this Project Blue Eyes, and it was a longitudinal study, and it was divided into 7 phases. So the first phase was training the ATOs to see if there were any modifications needed when our class arrived for BCT, any physical modifications. Phase 2 was BCT through our dually year, and that was focusing on our physical conditioning. And then phases 3 on, we're evaluating cadet results and adjusting the athletic program, the PE classes, PFTs, intramurals. For example, on the PFT, originally, our class did the flexed arm hang. Across the years, they decided, let's have them do pull-ups. So those are some of the things they did. But that whole, what they found was that the female cadets' performance far exceeded what their expectations were. And I think some of us may remember going in the dunk tape to get our body weight measured. I believe that, I believe that was part of Project Blue Eyes. But anyway, we've got a lot of good data out of that, and they made modifications as needed. So I talked about the flexed arm hang. Boxing and wrestling were replaced with fencing and weight training for upper body strength. So the bottom line on the athletic thing, though, was that it was really data driven. They wanted the facts, not the cultural assumptions. And then, of course, we had physical modifications to the academy itself. So in Vandenberg Hall, the 6th floor was modified, privacy partitions, and they converted, I'm going to say, a couple of restrooms. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know we didn't have a ton of them. And what that entailed was basically building a plywood box to slap on top of the urinals. It was a gray plywood box, and they put full-length mirrors. But that was about it. I want to go back to Colonel McCarthy's committee and the Commandant's committee. Both of them concluded that billeting females separately would be a problem. So when they moved half of us over to Saigon Hall at the end of the first semester, I'm not entirely convinced that was totally reactive. I'm sure part of it was, but I don't know that in the back of their mind, I think they always had the thought that to make this really work, eventually we need to actually be in the squadron. So maybe that was just a stepping stone. That's my opinion. I've looked and I can't find any of the reports to kind of dig in deeper to find out about that. Anyway, other changes. They made a beauty shop, and I looked back on all my journals, and back in the day, they took monthly $4 or something out of your cadet pay every month for the barber beauty shop, and I went 4 times in 4 years. It was a never used thing for me. They modified the women's locker room. They made more restrooms in Fairchild Hall. They redesigned the uniform. The cadet store had to be stocked with items that females would want to buy or needed to buy. And so, again, these committees were trying to think through everything that we would need in order to be successful. I think they were trying to set us up for success.
So, Ginny, I have to ask, where did you get your haircut? Because it wasn't allowed to touch the collar.
Well, you remember I'm a local girl, right? So
Yeah.
Now I would take an off-duty pass or something. My mom would cut my hair. So yeah, my mom.
That is awesome. I don't remember going off base there to get my haircut. But let's talk about all of those changes and how did we find all of those decisions? Ladies, what do you think? I remember the gray boxes over the urinals for sure.
Well, I was going to jump in terms of the housing decision, because even though we were in the dormitory with the men, we were still isolated. And I actually had recently asked for some memories from some of our male classmates. And one of the things they all mentioned who responded said, during BCT, we hardly saw you guys except when we were deliberately put together to do anything from, placement tests to marching. And, we were together when we went to the obstacle course and that sort of thing. But they all mentioned that they felt that they didn't get a chance to get to know us. And even during 4-degree year, it was the same. So I understand the reasoning behind putting us clustered in Vandenberg and then putting us clustered in Saigon with the notion of mutual support. And I think that was important. So I think they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place on this. But it was clear that the women needed to be assigned to third and fourth groups to Saigon, and that eventually we needed to actually live among our male classmates rather than being in the women's area.
I remember specifically around that issue, a couple of things. The same comment about, they didn't see us. I remember the fact that we had to get our training, where they came and dunked on us, to tell us to get our chins in and our shoulders back and down. That I felt like we not only were the recipients of that from our own squadron male leaders, but from every other squadron male leader. So it's my feeling that we always had somebody there training us and didn't have a lot of downtime because everybody thought we were all eating bonbons and, watching Oprah up there on the 6th floor. And so I just felt like we got an extra dose of all of that kind of normal, typical BCT training kind of thing. The other thing I remember very distinctly was in finals week of that first semester when they came in to tell us. I think that was a little bit of poor timing. I later talked to the cadet wing commander at that time about, do you guys understand the sort of trauma you put into us? Because we had these rumors about we are feeling badly. I got to stay, but feeling badly for the half of us that went over to the other side of the world. Where, Diane, I know you and Ginny both went to the other side of the world. We were worried because we heard rumors that you guys were walking into the briar patch. And that was right before you were taking all your finals. And we weren't going to see you once that was all done because you were going home. And when you came back, you were there. And we never got to see those people on the other side. So here's this group of women we had strongly bonded to that were just kind of ripped away and ripped apart. But Ginny, your comment about you think it was always part of the plan, I hadn't considered this, but in fact, it may have been to do it in a slightly more gradual way. Because we couldn't have done it in BCT because Saigon was used for other cadet programs, summer programs during that time. BCT was always usually all done out of Vandenberg at that time. So that would have been an interesting, I think, believable perspective. Ginny, that was likely what they were doing. And that's coming from, yes, I was a member of the Project Blue Eyes group all 4 years, and I remember all those don't taint tests as well. So, yeah, but some good conversation here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that planning, I talk about adding additional restrooms in Fairchild. I remember during BCT, the first day, I had to go to the bathroom so bad. And, you could only say sir, may I ask a question? No excuse, sir. The 7 responses. And I kept asking, sir, may I ask a question? What is it? I need to use the restroom. Keep going. Sir, may I ask a question? You need to, and none of the upperclassmen knew where a restroom was. And eventually they found one, the mailroom. I don't know if y'all remember going through the mailroom, but that was like the one known restroom. And there was just a line out the door of little brand new basic cadet girls trying to go to the bathroom. But so I think they may have had a restroom strategically, but maybe the upper class male cadets didn't know where they were to direct us. Another story about moving over to the other side. I will tell you that I was pretty terrible at my cadet staff's first semester when I was in 18th Squadron. When I moved into 33rd Squadron, Allison, I looked at that over Christmas break, and I'm like, I get a fresh start. And so I studied my staffs all Christmas break, and I moved to 33rd Squadron, and they never asked me my cadet staffs. That was such a laid back squadron. Anyway, it all turned out good, but I really wish I could find a source that said, yeah, this kind of gradual release of women was what the plan was. I haven't found anything to back that up, but to me, it makes sense.
Do you all remember, because I don't remember the boxes on the urinals, but I remember the artificial flowers in the urinals. Do any of you all remember that?
Yeah, I think the artificial flowers came first, and then they built the boxes.
Okay, because I remember the artificial fake flowers.
What did it take? 2 years before they finally just removed the urinals?
Yeah, 2 or 3, because I wrote in my journal, I think they finally accepted us. They took the boxes off the urinal over spring break one year or something.
Awesome.
It was
and we had our own locker room down in the athletic facility too. I wonder how that came about. But really, Ginny, it just really points out. Of course, we only had our perspective as basic cadets, but it seems like they did really decent planning. One thing I remember is that we were always, at least my squadron in basic, we were always running somewhere because the squadron forgot about us. It was like, oh, the women, we have to go get them, so we were always showing up sweaty and out of breath to some, whether it was a formation or second basic cadet training when we're in Jacks Valley and we were in a tent that was very much a lot closer to the guys because we were in tents right next to each other. But first, the first 3 weeks, it seemed like we were kind of an afterthought sometimes. I do remember that. But, granted, it was the first year, so I feel like they did their best. But it was scary over the, over the Christmas break to get ready to go over to 30th Squadron. I went from 4th Squadron to 30th Squadron, and that was very scary.
And I remember boo-hooing about losing my classmate and squadron mate, Diane.
Yeah, that's right. We were roommates for a while, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of running, I also remember, we made, largely when we did our running on the terrazzo, it was always a right-hand turn, which means as we sized those units, the tallest guy with the longest legs was in the pivotal position of setting the pace in the right-hand turn, and the shortest woman, typically all of the women, were in the back left corner sprinting the entire time, and they wondered why we fell out of races. So just as a little note, when I was a firstie or a senior, I would reverse the scenario and run it the other way. So the guy with the long legs got to stretch his legs and run harder at the back left corner.
Nice. Good one.
We're all still telling war stories, but let me throw in one little thing here. What's interesting is that at West Point and at the Naval Academy, the housing was never segregated in any way. The women were all just thrown in with the men, which it seems, our perceptions of the hidebound attitudes of those two administrations are, it just seems like they didn't even consider segregating the women. The rooms are like this, so that's where you're going to live. So, interesting tidbit.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of that was because they didn't have an ATO cadre like we had.
Not only that, Ginny and Karen, but my dad was pretty significant in the Army at the time of the decision to put women into the academies, and he advised me when I had option to go to the Air Force Academy because he knew they were still fighting it at West Point when we were going in and the women were showing up there. And he knew that the Air Force Academy had done more preparation and more planning, and he thought that would be easier on his daughter with a cause. And so I think probably they just didn't do some of the planning Ginny so wonderfully described that said this would probably do a little better if we do this in a little bit of a different approach.
Yeah, and it's not in the scope of this podcast, but if we did some data analysis, I'm pretty sure, and I'm sure the women were just as fine as the 157 of us that entered, but they had a much higher attrition in West Point the first year than we did. So I'm glad that I went to USAFA, I guess, yeah. So Ginny, what finally occurred? What happened?
All right, so what finally happened was in July 1975, Congress approved a weapons authorization bill, which also would open up the service academies to women. President Ford vetoed it, but the writing was on the wall. Everyone knew that this bill was going to pass sooner or later. And so at that point, the Academy began accepting female applications. And sure enough, President Ford signed Public Law 94-106 on October 7th, 1975. And the very next day, the Academy announced that the class of 80 would have women. And that operational plan that had been 4 years in the making was immediately enacted. So I think they were probably happy at that point that, hey, we've done the best we can to think through everything. So then the next thing they had to deal with was a recruitment push. An early concern was that they didn't have enough applications. At the end of October 75, there was 55 female nominations, but only 4 of them were from congressional sources. And so they launched a national campaign. And some of you may remember, Karen, I think that you recently looked at this, as they send out an academy catalog to counselors in high schools. They made an addendum called A New Opportunity for Women that went along with that. And it was just a little, I'm going to say 5x7 brochure thing, but it had a female cadet, some woman that was pretending to be a cadet, and they, had her modeling the uniform, and it had her lounging back in the dorm, chatting with her female classmates. It had her in the library, had her studying. I'm like, who is this? To me, she looked, as a 17-year-old, someone who's 25 looks ancient. And I'm like, who is this? That obviously can't be someone in our year group. And I don't think it was an ATO. So none of them matched that picture because I was looking for her when I showed up. But anyway, so they had this national campaign. Athletic coaches were already recruiting. We've already talked about, at least on the swimming side, they were very proactive about getting us. As I mentioned, 3 of us received our nomination or our appointment in January at 76. To manage the publicity, they decided to wait until they had a few more appointees. So in February, they had 3 more. So I'll tell you the names. The first 3 were me, Karen O'Hare. You may remember Karen O'Hare, and unfortunately she has passed away. Lisa Pena, she quit our dual year. And then we had Marianne Owens, who we all know, Kathy Bishop, and then Deanna Gaither. Side note about publicity, I think this is something that people outside our class just can't grasp the magnitude of this publicity. The day we arrived at the Academy, there were 47 news agencies there. All the national newspapers, magazines, they even had international coverage of us there, and they filmed us getting our haircut, getting our shots, going through the obstacle course. In fact, when I came to the Academy, because I was local, I had a news cameraman wasn't my choice. The news cameraman sat in the back seat filming me the 7-mile drive to the Air Force Academy. It was just like the worst ever. Publicity, I think, was a nightmare, and God bless our male classmates. They received hardly any publicity, and I always found them to be supportive. So kind of a side note there, but I think that gets lost on people that did not experience that wave of this is a first kind of thing happening. So by the end of January, there were 1,202 women that had received nominations, and then 157 were eventually appointed. So I think the bottom line to the whole academy part of the preparation was they really took a rigorous data-driven approach. This wasn't some experience fly-by-night thing. They really tried their best to consider everything they could. Obviously, there were glitches, but you would expect that with anything. So it wasn't that they were unprepared. Things are going to happen, but I think they did a really good job.
And so did you, Ginny. That was an awesome, lot of things I didn't know. So thank you for all of that wonderful history.
Yeah, and so, that wraps up this episode. Wow. I have to tell you, I'm feeling a little emotional. This was like, we gave birth to a podcast, ladies. So it was fantastic. So the next episode, we're going to talk to a couple of the air training officers, or ATOs, that we talked about today. And they're going to tell us their experience getting selected, etc., and what it was like to be an ATO. Those are the ones that welcomed us there and got us through our first year with women role models and leadership. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that whenever I did talk to each and every one of you, that you were more than willing to help out a classmate and tell our story, right? So it doesn't get lost. And the history, this set the foundation for the entire podcast. Thank you for listening to the first episode of 80s Ladies and Beyond. We hope you enjoyed it. We are looking forward to our next episode when we talk to two of the air training officers who served as role models and leaders for the class of 1980.